Okay, excellent. Well, welcome everyone to our second session of the day. We are so delighted that all of you are here. We have three amazing papers for you. I would like to direct your attention to the chat box, which has our abstract book. While I will introduce each of our speakers, I am not going to read their very impressive biographies because we only have an hour for three presentations, and I want to ensure that we have plenty of time for them to tell you all the interesting things that they want to tell you and for you to ask questions. So please refer to the abstract book for the biographies of our amazing scholars that we have this panel. And we are going to start with Debbie Busby, who today is going to be asking us about the good life, an etho-phenomenological exploration of relationships and well-being in the UK horse-human community. Please welcome Ms. Busby.
Oh, thanks very much, Tom. Thanks for that introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. And real big thanks to the conference organisers for inviting me to speak today. Oh, my screen won't move on, and before it did, and now it isn't doing. Why is that happening or not happening? There we are. Okay. So just to situate this talk, I'm bringing it to you as an early career researcher, roughly at the halfway stage of my PhD. I'm studying horse-human relationships at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK, supervised by doctors Helen Wadham and Vicky Novak. And my PhD is part-time. And in my day job, I work as a clinical equine behaviour consultant. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the dimensions and perceptions of care in the communities that my research is situated in, which is namely sports and leisure horses and riders in the UK. Looking at how opinions around those are formed and the interdisciplinary challenges that I'm faced with as an applied scientist, a clinical behaviourist, applied behaviourist, doing interpretivist qualitative research. So I feed it, I put rugs on it, it has new shoes every 6 weeks, it can blooming well do what I want it to do for the hour a day that I ride it or take it to a show. Versus, Buddy doesn't owe me anything, I'll do whatever it takes to give him the care he needs. He doesn't need to reciprocate. I'm sure most of you with equine experience are familiar with hearing similar phrases when you're on a stable yard or spending time with horse people. So why have I started my talk with these two quotes? Because they clearly exhibit two opposing sets of views about a horse owner's relationship with their horse. Here's another example. In 2012, I visited London to watch the Olympic dressage. My neighbour and I, we were strangers, didn't know each other beforehand. We struck up a conversation. We watched a horse and rider execute one of the dressage test movements, and we both commented at the same time. And she glowingly remarked, "Ooh, that was amazing." And I winced and observed, "Oh, that was awful." So we both chose to comment at the same time, but clearly we were experiencing the same phenomenon quite differently. So why am I telling you this? Because feelings around the sustainability of an activity practiced by around 2.5 million people in the UK are hotting up. Non-riders are starting to see more of what was formerly behind the scenes treatment of horses, and they have an opinion about what they see. The eye of social license to operate has turned towards equestrian sports, and communities, businesses, livelihoods and identities are at risk. As equitation scientist Dr. Andrew McLean said recently, everyone has an opinion and a camera and a social platform. And in another claim from a conversation with a sport and welfare commentator and also a veterinarian, is dressage will be dead within the next 20 years. So horse riders and sports bodies have been fighting back with a typical, you don't know what you're talking about, we are the experts riposte. But that's not going down well with the opinionated public. And equine welfare and behaviour science backs up the latter to a large extent. The bastion of horse sports, the International Equestrian Federation, or the FEI, has been under attack for permitting riding practices that cause pain and distress, culminating in the FEI being driven, shamed, some would say, as a body, by the risk of losing their social licence to set up the FEI Ethics and Wellbeing Commission to address societal concerns related to the use of horses in sport. So the commission brings together equestrians, FEI representatives, and equine behaviour and welfare experts to develop an ethical framework intended to influence sport horse training practices, and including perspectives such as the telos of the horse, or the horseness of the horse, we would say, as they become their own species. Also, the ethics of training techniques and methods. Is a training practice acceptable just because a horse tolerates it? And how can we use behavioural indicators to assess well-being? With greater visibility and a wider range of opinions, is horse riding even sustainable at all as a leisure or a sporting activity in the 21st century? And whether at present it is or whether it isn't, what is it that needs to change in order to strengthen any argument for sustainability? Why does it need to change, and how can it change? In the UK, there's a defined social and economic community or communities of horse riders and associated groups and individuals. And this situates those communities within a research domain of sustainability. The activity of horse riding itself co-creates the relationship between the horse and the rider. The relationship is interspecies, obviously. It's extremely embodied. That's a very foregrounded element of the activity. And the relationship is unequal. So typically the horse has little choice about what they are asked to do by the rider. Although the horse has the physical potential through their own motivation to perform any of the behaviours on their natural or their conditioned ethogram, the rider has a view about what they want the horse to do, and the power in the relationship is situated in the rider because of how they apply riding technologies to achieve their desired outcome in the behaviour expressed by the horse. So we can certainly see, as I've just said, that there are power relations involved in the activities of horse riding, discussed in the literature by authors such as Burke, Thompson, Dashper and Coulter. And there are also issues of social justice involved, framed especially by the work of Donaldson and Kimlicka, who propose that domesticated animals have a right to shape and to choose their interactions with us, and we should acknowledge their entitlements politically and morally as legitimate subjects of justice. Animal welfare criteria raise questions around ethical training methods and equine welfare, raised in the Horseman report for World Horse Welfare and most recently explored by Luke et al. And feminist and interspecies ethics of care also feature in this interdisciplinary landscape, explored by authors such as Donovan and Gilligan, and emerging as a relevant critical perspective from which to explore how and why people care for horses, how that care is interpreted, and how horse owners perceive their own behaviours of care. Some of the challenges that horses find themselves caught up in their horse-human entanglements are what I call, and others do, is speed production, bringing horses into sporting activity too young and too quickly, and then the wastage that accompanies these practices, which Gilbert and Gillett have written about, and being misunderstood by the humans who organise the horses' lives, which Bell et al. Surveyed in relation to humans' inability to correctly interpret horses' emotions based on the body language they observed. Some of the current "what are we doing with horses" conversations revolve around the publication of scientific evidence that now allows better assessment of physical pain in horses via measurable behavioural signs, thanks to work by Dyson, McDonnell and Torsivia. And Meller's 5 domains model of animal welfare also forms part of the discussions around what constitutes a good life for horses, and that's grounded in biological and ethological science. So why am I asking the questions that are shown on this slide? Well, one reason is I'm 20 years into my career as an equine behaviourist, or an applied ethologist, as it could just as easily be described. And I've been involved with horse and riders in other aspects of my career and my life for over half a century. And I've never not been asking critical questions during all that time. So in my PhD, I'm taking this opportunity to explore the questions that have occurred to me over a lifetime with horses. And my work as a behaviourist, grounded as that is in very positivist science, provides a rich experiential insight into the nuances and complexities of the interspecies struggles and successes that make up the life world of the dyad, the horse-human dyad. And I aim to explore this relationship, curious as to whether the experience of both species can be transformed into one of co-created understanding and pleasure. I'm asking what's in it for the horse, and I'm advocating for and valuing a recognition and a respect of the horse's agency and the protection of their health, well-being and rights to enable them to live free from harm, abuse and neglect. There will, no doubt about it, be consequences for all of us who ride or work with horses of knowing more about how they think and feel. And one way of couching my overall question is, does a good life for horses, for horse owners and riders, have to mean a poor life for horses? So it matters then in terms of sustainability and the future of horse riding, and therefore of horses, that more is known about the horse-human dyad and its lived experience. Because of my interest in critical interpretivist methodologies, I have chosen to look at this through a phenomenological and an ethnological lens, made interdisciplinary by the inclusion of positivist, ethological, behavioural and welfare science, which inform my professional practice as a clinical equine behaviourist. And I think I'm coming to my last slide now, which is that the starting point of my research was the societal level interest in horse-human relations. And some recent conversations that have come out of my data collection are turning towards the concept of safeguarding. So something I'm interested to explore further is how the concept of safeguarding might be extended to horses as vulnerable individuals. And you can see some of the discourses here on the screen. Safeguarding vulnerable humans means looking out for the well-being of others when they may not be in a position to do so for themselves. Sometimes having difficult conversations in the interest of keeping someone safe or protecting them from harm. Safeguarding is a serious daily reality in the human sphere. So how might we start to expand these conversations about putting this into practice to protect and promote the well-being of horses? I'm going to leave you with that thought. That's the end of my talk. Here's how to contact me, please do. And I've got some references on these 2 slides, which you're welcome to access. I'm happy to make the slides available to you. So I'm happy to answer any questions now, and I shall stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. And I know that we are going to have some good questions for you. We are going to hold those questions, though, until the other two speakers go. We've already started collecting questions. If any of you have some, remember, you can put them on the Padlet, or you can just hold on and ask them in person. But our next talk is going to be from Sian Moody. It will be called Untangling the Wildcat's Cradle: Folklore, Histories, Inheritance, and Futures.
So I'm looking at the history of wildcats at the moment. My broader PhD is looking at the ethical and social dimensions, but for this particular focus, I'm looking at the history of wildcats. And I'm hoping to try and understand how we can help to pave the way for a better future in this messy cat's cradle. So I just wanted to flag a trigger warning, because I will be discussing some historical persecution of the wildcat, including hunting and the fur trade. I should also note that I'm not a historian. I'm a social scientist by trade. Yeah, this has been quite an interesting lesson for me. And apologies to any historians out there if I completely faux pas on any historical accuracy. Okay. So, revere me or fear me, I am the courtshie. In my feline form, among you I roam free. Bury your dead, or else I may steal your soul. Ward me away to keep your fallen whole. Loud music and bustle, you play these late wakes. This sprinkling of catnip may distract my wicked taste. But I am not all bad, good fortune I can bring. A saucer of milk may soften my talking. For I am a fortune teller, whose good fortune you should seek. Gaze into my eye, your heart's desire I seek. For a glimpse into the fairy world here you may see. For I am courtshie, a fairy cat. Come join me. So, who is the wildcat? Well, their Latin name is Felis sylvestris sylvestris. They're the UK's only wild native feline species. They previously were abundant across England, Wales, and Scotland, but extensive hunting and habitat destruction caused rapid decline throughout the Victorian era, resulting in their extinction from England and Wales by the mid-19th century. The Scottish wildcat descended from the wider European stock. They were most likely present in Great Britain since the early Holocene, when Doggerland still connected the British Isles to continental Europe. So wildcat remains have been found at the Mesolithic camp at Thatcham, Berkshire, and that dates from around 10 to 9,000 years ago. In the last century, they survived in low numbers in the Scottish Highlands and became commonly known as the Scottish wildcat. Their numbers recovered slightly after World War I, when the Scottish Forestry commissioned substantial reforestation, but despite this, their numbers dwindled over the last 50 years, pressured by poor habitat availability and excessive hybridization with the domestic cat. This led to a steady dilution of the species gene pool, and in 2021, the rate of hybridization was such that the IUCN found the Scottish wildcat to be extinct in the wild. I'm intensely interested in the issue of hybridization, but that's a topic for another time. So now they're absolutely on the brink of extinction in the UK, and this has triggered a nationwide breeding programme of captive wildcats. They were reintroduced into the Scottish Highlands this year, and feasibility studies are underway to assess the suitability of wildcat reintroduction in Wales, South West England, and Kent, also in England. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is the ethics of conservation. So obviously the anthropogenic forces that result or contribute to species extinction can cause immense pain or suffering to the animals caught in its wake. For example, rapidly declining habitats, food sources, or toxicity cause painful death. Sadly, the suffering goes largely unheard, and many species go extinct without notice. And the rate of extinction is extensive. We are in the 6th mass extinction, and understood to be a contributing factor to the environmental and climate breakdown. This has ethical implications to individual animals, but also to the wider planetary health. And of course, within conservation, practices also require the scrutiny. What are the ethical implications of protecting one species for killing another, culling as a means of population control, captive breeding with the loss of liberty, and more, the breeding stock at the expense of the potential survival of the species, persecution from human-wildlife conflict? Haraway, Van Doren and Rose and others urge that we pay attention to these individual lives so that we can be rendered responsible. Paying attention can make for some uncomfortable truths, of course, but in doing so, perhaps we'll finally move towards and closer to other animals, bringing our worlds together, bringing them in to make worlds together in all its messy and uncertain ways. Paying attention not only is an ethical duty, it rallies our ethical calling and binds us in a multi-species world. By bringing together animals into our, by bringing animals into our spheres of attention, we learn about them, we follow their stories, we feel their plight more. This process of learning is a process of learning to be affected, as Jamie Lorimer describes it, and is, I feel, a critical process if humans are to find rhythm with a more than human world and genuinely make the compromises needed for a better multi-species coexistence. Lorimer identifies animal charisma as a key feature in holding the human gaze. And while some animals fit this requirement well, elephants, lions, and orangutans, for example, how can those animals who live in obscurity or those perceived as transgressive garner the same large-scale emotional response to not only support conservation efforts, but make the necessary compromises to enable survival of such species on the brink of extinction? This arguably is a key challenge facing the wildcat. They are intensely private animals who, unlike their domestic counterpart, are untameable and intensely seclusive. Not only does this make getting to know them more difficult, but should a small population be released into the southwest, it is also highly unethical to force these new individuals into the physical gaze of the public. Unlike the stork or the European beaver, species both in the process of being reintroduced across England, it will be much harder for members of the general public to even see a living wildcat, let alone get to know one. The web that links multi-species life is more than interpersonal ties, of course. In this particular web, this cat's cradle, the people of Britain have shared a long history with the wildcat. Researching the human wildcat history in Britain can tell us perhaps a little bit about the wildcat, but also reawaken cultural memories that may serve to strengthen local people's sense of place. With non-human animals we once coexisted with. As Marianne Crace, an anthropologist who specialises in Celtic folklore, has suggested, folklore may be a compelling tool to counteract apathy towards the local environment. And it is at this local level that Singh argues we can fight our way through the destruction of the Anthropocene, as stories of past, present, and future unfold in patches across our landscape. So, what can the human wildcat history in Britain? What is it, and how can we use this to foster a better coexistence for the future? Well, so the first signs of human wildcat culture began in Celtic folklore. Around 2,500 years ago, tribes of people now called the Celts arrived in the British Isles and made it their home. Although separate and often warring tribes, they shared similar traditions and beliefs. Recent DNA analysis of feline skeletal remains found around Celtic villages has revealed that wildcats lived alongside Celtic people throughout this period, much to the surprise of researchers who were expecting the samples to show the felines were of domestic cats, Felis catus. In fact, archaeological research has recently found that the domestic cat wasn't introduced into Britain until the late Roman period, around the 5th century AD. Cats played an important part in Celtic mythology. It was believed that all cats could be fairies, taking feline form to walk amongst humans, and as such, they were both revered and feared for their magical powers. The poem I gave at the start of this presentation is a retelling of a legendary cat figure in Scottish and Irish mythology, the courtshie, phonetically spelt in the English tongue as catspit. This magical creature resembles a large feline the size of a Labrador, with black fur and white spots on their chest. They were feared for stealing the souls to the fairy realm, yet believed to bestow good fortune too. Other interpretations saw the courtshie as a witch able to take the form of a cat 9 times. In the literature, fairy cats appear to be more closely linked to Felis catus than Felis sylvestris, but the Element Encyclopedia of Magical Creatures argues that their fierce and secretive nature more closely aligns them to that of the wildcat rather than the domestic cat, despite their black fur. Others, inspired by sightings of Scotland's Kellis cat, which is the image in the middle here, surmise that the courtshie's origin story is probably based on cat-wildcat hybrids. The Kellis cat is a large feline that roamed, and perhaps still does, the Scottish Highlands. Sightings were so rare it was believed to be a hoax until several of these cats were shot in the last century. Analysis of their bodies revealed the Kellis cat is a cat-wildcat hybrid, except for one who was a melanistic wildcat. That is to say, a pure wildcat with naturally darker fur. When we consider how the domestic cat was not introduced into Britain until the 5th century, and that melanistic wildcats do occur, it doesn't seem too much of a stretch to conclude that Celtic cat mythology is in fact based on wildcats, not their domestic counterpart. Furthermore, wildcats played a central role in many of the early clans of Ireland, and particularly across Scotland. Caithness, which translates to the land of cats, was home to the Pictish tribe who revered the wildcat. Honoured for their untamable nature, their fierce spirit was adopted as clan crests, mottos, and totems. This reverence continues today, with, for example, the chief of Sunderland's clan being known as the Moorish Chat, great man of the cats, while the clan Mackintosh don a fierce cat on their crest with the motto, touch not the cat without the glove, which you can see here on the far right of the image, the slide. The fierce nature of the wildcat clearly speaks to Scottish clan heritage and identity, and the Scottish Wildcat Conservation Campaign have mobilised this depiction by naming the Scottish wildcat the Highland Tiger. Here we can see how history and heritage are being used to help pave a way for better multi-species existence. But what about in England? There is very little from Celtic England about wildcats, or even cats in general, though I am still looking. This is most likely because the Roman invasion of the 1st century never managed to breach the Scottish borders, and so Celtic traditions held on for much longer. I believe wildcats are still linked to the magical reign, and I'm currently exploring some lucky charms from the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, which looks suspiciously like wildcats. In England, the Celtic culture merged with Roman culture until being almost lost in the 5th century in the rise of Anglo-Saxons. By the time we get to medieval England, which spans from 1066 to 1485, records of wildcats become almost exclusively found in hunting licenses. These records speak of a legacy that would result in the complete extinction of the species some 500 years later. But as Ray highlights, they are also key documents in helping us map the distribution of wildcats across England. These records indicate that wildcats were prolific across England. For example, between the 13th and 14th centuries, 143 hunting licenses were issued to hunt wildcats in royal forests. They're usually listed with a number of other low-level species, indicating their high abundance and low status. Numerous wildcat place names also originated during this period, once again indicating the wildcat as a common feature of the landscape. For example, Catsbyville in Gloucester was originally named Catsbury in 1266, which translates as the Cat's Grove. Despite their low status, wildcats were obviously still feared by the people of England, as evident from one of the only wildcat legends that remains in people's consciousness today, the story of the cat and the man of St. Peter's Church. So St. Peter's Church is in Banbury in Yorkshire, I believe. And this story goes that one day a knight was walking home, and he was riding home on his horse, and he was suddenly attacked by a giant cat, possibly a lynx, but possibly a wildcat. And they fought all the way back to the church. And the story ends with the cat killing the man and the man killing the cat. And that is the legend of the cat and the man. So it's interesting to note that this is one of the only stories that England remembers about wildcats. And in it, the cats are depicted as fearsome and a fearsome rival and foe, without the honour ascribed in the Scottish folklore. So by the early modern period, there are fewer hunting records around in this period, but hunting obviously did continue, as evident by naturalists reporting the wildcat extinction in several of England's counties. So wildcats were reportedly common sources of fur during this time. Stingman, for example, believes that wildcat fur was most likely a commoner's fur for lining mittens and shawls, and sometimes even full coats. The value of the wildcat is further alluded to in the sumptuary law, which state that the lower classes could only wear fox, cat, or rabbit. Wildcats were also hunted for their perceived medicinal value. So, for example, in 1693, William Salmon mentioned how body parts of the wildcat were used for medicinal purposes. Its flesh for treating gout, its fat for dissolving tumours and easing pain, and its blood for curing fallen sickness, and its excrement for treating baldness. It's quite grim reading. Roman and Anglo-Saxon England had brought with it new waves of Christianity, which merged with the strong beliefs about cats' magical powers and links to the fairy world. As Christianity grew more popular, of course, cats increasingly became associated as devil workers, which eventually accumulated in their widespread persecution with witches between the 15 and 1800s. Wild cats appear scantily in the literature around this time, so it's difficult to say with any certainty how they fed into this narrative. But there are a few mentions. But the few mentions they do receive frame them within this fierce and untamable nature. For example, in The Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare writes, "Thou must be married to no man but me, for I am he, and born to tame you, Kate, and bring you from a wild cat to a Kate, comfortable as the other household Kates." So by the time we get to the 1800s, the prolonged persecution of wildcats caused them to become extinct in most of England, bar a few last strongholds in Exmoor, North Devon, and the Lake District in Cumbria in northern England. By the mid-1800s, various naturalists declared them extinct in England, across all of England, although there is an interesting account of wildcats living at a location in Exmoor, North Devon, just before the First World War started. So needless to say, they have not been seen there since, however. And that more or less brings us up to contemporary times. So a recent publication, which came out earlier this year, The Wildcats of Exeter, which is a medical sort of a medieval whodunit, and this depicts the same narrative of wildcats as fierce aggressors. But there are other accounts of wildcats from the last sort of 20 years or so, where they're portraying a different picture of respect and one of desperate survival, actually. So one example of this is The Wildcat Haven by the naturalist and avid wildcat advocate Mike Tomkes, who interestingly conservationists have some conservationists find him quite problematic, and that's something that I'm also looking into with my research. So, a future of coexistence. The history of wildcats in England that I've managed to piece together reveals some key themes. They've experienced extensive persecution, of course, and were represented as fierce and aggressive beasts, likely aggravated by Christianity's interpretation of cat fairy magic. There are very scant records of them, suggesting that they were of little importance to humans or in the human consciousness for years. Any positive representation of them in English Celtic folklore has either been lost or interpreted incorrectly, I feel, as relating to the domestic cat. For me, the lack of details or stories about wildcats is the story for how we move forward. We are currently exploring naming the wildcat the woodcat for its potential Devon release. This is an old folk name for them, and perhaps will prevent some of the fearful perspectives that haunted them in the past. More so, though, I hope that by telling this story, the public will feel compelled to right previous wrongs, to give them a voice, and to celebrate them, and may perhaps help to appreciate their value by respecting their preference for solitude and support them and their contribution to our ecosystem. Thank you so much for listening, and questions and comments are, of course, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sian. And I am a historian, and I can tell you that was just great. That was just great. Wildcats are so interesting. We know them over here in the US largely because they are constant mascots for our sports teams, as are bobcats. And they always tell us that bobcats and wildcats are the exact same thing with just a different name. I don't know if that's true or not. We just kind of take it unquestionably over here. And we will have questions, and we will have them right after our last talk. Our last talk of this session is from Colleen Winkelman. We are going to move back to horses now. We started with horses, and we will end with horses. And the topic of Colleen's talk is burnout and biting, horses communicating in equine-assisted therapies. Please welcome Colleen Winkelman.
So this presentation is a preliminary impression from my fieldwork data. As I'm just returning and still putting this together, I greatly welcome suggestions and comments. As a general warning, this presentation discusses poor welfare and pain and suffering of horses. There are no images of that. All the images are very friendly. In my first volunteer tour around the therapy center, Hannah, the volunteer coordinator, told us that our horses love their job. They just light up with their riders, she said. Their demeanor totally changes. In example, she went on, during the COVID shutdown, the center closed for about 6 months, and the only people here were myself and an instructor and the director to care for them. They seemed depressed, and kind of down. When the vet brought her 2 children, the horses just crowded around them, excited to see kids and maybe get a chance to work. As she talked, I looked over the large iron gate at 120, wondering if this could be true. Do these horses love what they do? While this is a broad and difficult question to explore, what is clear from the 11 months I spent in West Texas that therapeutic work takes a significant toll on horse brains and bodies. While I was aware prior to this that therapy was hard work for horses, coming to know these horses and witnessing their lives provided a new level of understanding I didn't expect. Instead of wondering if they love their job, I wondered how the conditions of their work affected their ability to perform this job. Importantly, how did the horses communicate their feelings? Though horses do not use human language, there is communication between horses and humans. They're highly social animals who've evolved alongside humans, and as many recent studies demonstrate, have understandings of human facial expression and emotions and conceptions of individual people. While there's been significant interest in human-equine interactions, most attention has been focused on either the horse or human response, primarily focused on stress and benefits. Less has been done to explore how human perspectives shape those interactions and affect equine welfare. There's a desire, especially in equine-assisted services, to think about horses as partners. This desire is wrought with issues of power, as humans have considerable control over what domestic horses do and how they live. Yet people continually discuss the partnerships and negotiation that happens between horses and humans without often addressing the issue of power. Several people have told me that if horses did not want to do something, they would not do it. They are large and willful creatures. Yet when a horse communicates displeasure or discomfort, this often does not result in them having not to do something. As Linda Burke and Curly Thompson state, horses may be required to do work, yet they appear to collaborate. They make decisions when involved in therapy. Equine decision-making is fundamental to how meetings of animals and humans proceed. I follow this idea, seeking to address the power asymmetry while taking seriously how horses influence relationships and how interactions are shaped by communities of practice, which in my study is I consider to be multi-species communities tied by a shared practice which members learn and develop through regular interaction with each other. I question how, through ideas of partnerships and therapists, power is obscured in ways which support conceptions that lead to poor welfare and mask horse attempts at legitimate communication. Most everyone I interviewed stated that simply just being around horses was therapeutic. It is perhaps destabilizing for them to begin to question whether horses are unwilling, not as invested, or even harmed in their partnership with them. How does this and other conceptions about horses affect how horse communication is responded to? I spent 11 months from September 2022 to August 2023 in West Texas doing participant observation at a collegiate equestrian center, volunteering in lessons, handling and caring for horses, and becoming a student instructor. I became a type of unofficial staff member, being involved in events, schooling horses, and frequently spending time at I took observational notes on my interactions and what I saw inside and outside of the session to better understand the larger context of the center, its people, and horses. Given my experience with horses and the relationships I have built with people at the center, I was allowed pretty free access to the horses within reason. To come to know my horse informants, I spent several hours sitting in paddocks, allowing the horses to interact with me as they wished, and observing how they interacted with each other. This practice was fundamental to understanding these horses as individual subjects and coming to know them as I had my human informants. It provided me with a comparison to a horse's behavior when interacting with different individuals and a way to understand how certain ideas about who horses were as individuals were created and circulated. Additionally, I interviewed instructors, volunteers, and clients and others involved in the center about their horse experience, understandings of equine-assisted therapies, and human-horse communication. I also videotaped human-horse interactions and horse-horse interactions at the site. And I'm currently in the process of reviewing these data sets, and I'm happy to talk further about the analysis. A little background on place and also equine-assisted therapy. Horses are integral in Texan identity, especially where I was in West Texas. On the Texas Department of Agriculture website, we see here, it reads, "The strength and character of these horses have become synonymous with the Texas way of life. Texas has a horse for every rider." The horses referred to here are often imagined as agricultural workers, horses who are ridden for hours on a range, cutting cattle. Even people who had no relationship to ranch work wanted their horses to be able to perform as a cattle horse. The idea that horses are intended for valuable work shapes Texan understandings of human-horse relationships. These ideas are heavily present in the equine-assisted therapies as well, though horses are doing very different work in these things. Therapies in my fieldwork involved psychotherapy and counseling, hippotherapy, where horse movement and body is a tool to assist in therapeutic goals, and therapeutic riding and horsemanship, where people learn in adaptive ways how to ride and work with horses. There's a range of human activities that horses and humans might do, but most sessions involve walking, perhaps trotting, pattern work, obstacle courses, grooming, or tacking, either mounted or on the ground. Before I left for field work, an equine specialist from Washington told me in a conversation that this work is fundamentally stressful. They're often surrounded by people, there are sudden noises and movements, and they have to carry unbalanced riders with bodies that may be different than ones they're used to. Their hair gets pulled, their faces get tugged, and their sides get kicked. Despite this, there is little guidance on how to specifically prepare horses for this type of work. When asked about preparing horses, my informants would often speak about selecting good-tempered horses and desensitization tactics. I witnessed horses used in therapy have chronic behavior and unsoundness issues, which greatly affected sessions and horse use. The majority of issues I observed involved leg lameness and back swings, biting people and objects, issues at the mounting block, and general avoidance of pushiness. These patterns align with current work being done to explore behavioral issues and high turnover rates. The top issues reported among therapeutic horses to be limb lameness and back soreness, according to Watson et al. And among the primary reasons for retiring, rehoming, or giving a horse time off were behavior issues, unsoundness, age, and burnout, according to rankings. Therapy horses are heavily selected for good temperament, movement, and health, yet horses in different places struggle with similar issues in this work. As my friend and informant said to me in an interview, how do we keep the good horses good if we can't? I'll now turn to a specific horse to illustrate this. A 17-year-old Norwegian fjord I'll refer to as Ivy. In comparison with the rest of the herd, Ivy is more ambivalent towards humans. She's not mean, and she would not run away from me, but her temperament was not considered as ideal as other horses, who readily greet humans with great interest. In the paddock with me, she is curious and often open to being massaged or scratched, especially if one of her friends is with us. Since I met her in September, she's had an issue with biting the horse. In the beginning, these instances were predominantly at the mounting block or occasionally throughout the season. While I never actually got bit by her, she attempted numerous times while I was handling her, though notably never when I was with her handling her. The biting itself was not sudden. She gave many warnings, lipping, moving her head to the side towards me, ears back, eyes and nostril tips. In instances when it was sudden, her bite was often in direct response to something that caused acute pain or discomfort, such as a larger person's weight suddenly on her. If we consider Ivy's work life, how people understood her and handled her, her biting can be understood as reasonable communication. First, because Ivy was a fjord and thought of as a draft with vastly different capacities for weight, she was often made to carry riders who were arguably too big for her. There is much debate around a weight of riders that I'll not get into, but I will say that in this instance, I witnessed how strained her body was while carrying some of these riders, and that Often she would have increased biting. Her own body condition likely made it more difficult for her to carry weight. People also thought of fjords as less sensitive than their quarter horse counterparts and required more harsh handling and best illustrated by how people instructed students to ride Ivy, by telling them not to use their legs because she doesn't listen, and so to use their reins and bit. In my experience riding her and instructing clients on her, this is a gross misunderstanding. In December, after she had a break, I tried to use her in a lesson with a small child. She had no instances of biting and rather seemed content or at least very neutral. Then at special events where horses were essentially giving pony rides, she would have major episodes of biting in terms of frequency and severity. People often dealt with this by yanking their lead or even hitting, though note, never when a child was on. At one event in the spring, this escalated when Ivy bit the director on the arm quite hard. For people at the center, this bite crossed the line. The director was considered special in terms of her relations with horses, so this bite became evidence of the severity of Ivy's behavior. As I was leaving in August, Ivy now seems to have a very small threshold for any kind of handling or riding, regardless of time. From my observations, sessions in riding and handling were major sources of stress for Ivy, especially as her behavior with me and others in the paddock outside of work rarely involved biting. It was often really pleasant. Ivy's attempts at communicating did not bring about changes which alleviated her discomfort, and she was consistently punished for them. So her suffering continued, and she eventually became a very unwilling participant in any activity. Horses use their mouths to explore their environment and to communicate with each other. For them, mouths and facial expression are legitimate forms of communication. In most instances of Ivy biting, people took it as willful mistakes, as Ivy purposely being difficult, sometimes even that she was trying to avoid work. The attitude adjustment called for often referred to abstract punishments and harsh tactics. People would say things like, he doesn't want to work, but that's too bad. Sometimes I don't want to work either. Or she should be grateful she has such a cush job. She only works 4 days a week. These statements anthropomorphize Ivy in a harmful way, which masks her agency and negates her participation in any partnership. Very few considered what Ivy was doing as legitimate and reasonable communication from a horse's perspective. Further, they did not see these issues as connected to any issue in Ivy's welfare or unhappiness work in a meaningful way. Doing so, I will say that is risky for people. It calls into question Ivy's welfare as well as the knowledge and ethics of those in charge. My informants' lives are intimately tied with my horse informants' lives. Those who do think the way I'm suggesting feel powerless and overwhelmed to enact meaningful change. They risk being socially ostracized, restricted from activities, access to horses, not being able to progress in their professions, and potentially losing their income. Practitioners and researchers struggle with the ethical question of using horses in therapy. It might be easy, given Ivy's story, to say that we should not use them at all. However, in this example stands out because it's an instance of refusal. As others have pointed out before, we notice agency more when it involves resistance and often dismiss instances of cooperation. As I go through my data, I'll be looking for both and probably struggling with this question. What is important to me in Ivy's story is imagining what could have changed if she was taken seriously as a partner, whose life is often at our best. Could we have found a way to make her happy in her work or made the decision to remove her completely? Witnessing Ivy demonstrates how important it is for horses that we address our own perceptions of it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Colleen. That was wonderful. Okay, now we have questions.